The dusty roads of Ouagadougou had never seen such unusual activity. Black SUVs with tinted windows moved slowly through the capital of Burkina Faso, carrying passengers who seemed out of place in the West African nation. Local residents stopped their daily routines to watch the convoy pass, wondering what important business was bringing such visitors to their country. Captain Ibrahim Traoré sat in his modest office at the presidential palace, reviewing reports about his country's ongoing struggles. At just 34 years old, he had become one of Africa's youngest leaders after taking power in September 2022. The former military officer wore his characteristic simple uniform, a stark contrast to the elaborate outfits favored by many African leaders. His desk was covered with papers showing concerning statistics about healthcare, education, and economic development in Burkina Faso. The young captain had spent months trying to transform his country from within. He had implemented policies to reduce government waste, fought against corruption, and worked tirelessly to improve conditions for ordinary citizens. However, one challenge seemed impossible to solve alone: the healthcare crisis that was claiming thousands of lives across his nation. Diseases that could be easily prevented in wealthy countries were still killing children and adults in Burkina Faso. His aide knocked on the door and entered with an expression of surprise mixed with excitement. "Captain, we have received an unusual request for a meeting. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation wants to discuss a healthcare partnership with our government. Bill Gates himself is requesting a personal meeting with you." Traoré looked up from his papers, his young face showing both curiosity and caution. He had heard about Bill Gates and his foundation's work in Africa, but he had never expected the Microsoft founder to show interest in Burkina Faso. The country was often overlooked by international organizations and wealthy donors who preferred to focus on larger, more stable African nations. "What exactly do they want to discuss?" Traoré asked, leaning back in his chair. He had learned to be suspicious of sudden interest from wealthy foreigners, especially after witnessing how international partnerships had failed to benefit ordinary Africans in the past. The aide consulted his notes carefully. "They mentioned something about a new vaccine program and healthcare infrastructure development. The foundation is apparently looking for a partner country in West Africa to implement some kind of pilot project. They believe Burkina Faso could be an ideal location." Traoré stood up and walked to the window overlooking the courtyard of the presidential palace. Outside, he could see the everyday reality of his country, people going about their business with determination despite the challenges they faced. Children played in the dusty courtyard while their mothers carried water containers and market goods. These were the people he had promised to serve when he took office. The young leader had made many promises to his people about improving health care and reducing child mortality. He had spoken passionately about making Burkina Faso self-sufficient and less dependent on foreign aid. However, the reality of governing had shown him how difficult it was to achieve these goals with limited resources and infrastructure. "Tell me more about this foundation," Traoré said, returning to his desk. "What have they done in other African countries? Have their programs actually helped people, or are they just another form of foreign control disguised as charity?" His aide had prepared for these questions. Over the past few hours, he had researched the Gates Foundation extensively. "Captain, their record is mixed but generally positive. They have funded vaccination programs that have eliminated diseases like polio from several countries. They have also invested in malaria prevention and HIV treatment programs across Africa. However, some critics argue that their approach creates dependency and that wealthy donors should not have so much influence over public health policy in poor countries." Traoré nodded thoughtfully. He had heard similar debates about foreign aid and international charity work. As a young African leader, he was particularly sensitive to anything that might undermine his country's sovereignty or dignity. At the same time, he could not ignore the potential benefits if the partnership was structured properly. The captain had grown up in rural Burkina Faso and had seen firsthand how preventable diseases destroyed families and communities. His own family had lost relatives to illnesses that could have been easily treated with proper medical care and vaccines. These personal experiences had shaped his commitment to improving healthcare for all Burkinabe people. "Schedule the meeting," Traoré finally decided, but make it clear that we will only discuss partnerships that respect our sovereignty and benefit our people directly. I want to hear what they have to offer, but I will not accept any arrangement that treats Burkina Faso as a testing ground for foreign experiments. News of the upcoming meeting began to spread quietly through diplomatic channels and international health organizations. Many observers were curious about what would happen when the young, idealistic African leader met with one of the world's most influential philanthropists. Some predicted a natural partnership based on shared goals, while others expected tensions over different approaches to development and healthcare. Traoré spent the following days preparing for the meeting by consulting with his health ministers, economic advisors, and trusted military colleagues. He wanted to understand exactly what his country needed and what it could offer in return. The captain was determined to approach the meeting as an equal partner rather than a grateful recipient of charity. Meanwhile, Bill Gates and his team were making their own preparations for the historic encounter. The foundation had identified Burkina Faso as a potentially important partner for several reasons. The country had a young, dynamic leader who seemed committed to real change. It also had significant healthcare challenges that could benefit from targeted interventions. Most importantly, success in Burkina Faso could serve as a model for other African nations facing similar problems. As the day of the meeting approached, both sides knew they were about to engage in a conversation that could change the future of healthcare in West Africa and potentially influence how international development partnerships are structured across the continent. The morning sun cast long shadows across the presidential palace courtyard as security teams from both sides conducted final preparations. Bill Gates arrived in Ouagadougou aboard a private aircraft, accompanied by a small team of foundation executives, medical experts, and security personnel. Despite his immense wealth and global influence, Gates had chosen to travel with minimal fanfare, understanding that excessive displays of luxury might send the wrong message to his young host. Captain Traoré had decided to receive his guest in the palace's main conference room rather than his personal office. The room was decorated with traditional Burkinabe art and artifacts, creating an atmosphere that celebrated local culture while remaining professional enough for serious diplomatic discussions. The captain wore his standard military uniform, clean and pressed but deliberately simple, representing his commitment to modest leadership. When Gates entered the conference room, both men sized each other up quickly. Gates, now in his late 60s, with graying hair and his characteristic glasses, carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to high-stakes meetings. Traoré, despite being decades younger, projected the assured presence of a leader who had earned respect through action rather than inheritance. The handshake between the two men lasted several seconds longer than typical diplomatic greetings. Photographers captured the moment from multiple angles, understanding instinctively that they were documenting something historically significant. The image would later be analyzed by media outlets around the world. The young African revolutionary leader meeting with the American technology billionaire turned philanthropist. Captain Traoré, Gates began, speaking in clear English while maintaining steady eye contact. Thank you for agreeing to this meeting. I have been following the changes you have implemented in Burkina Faso with great interest. Your commitment to serving your people is exactly the kind of leadership that gives me hope for Africa's future. Traoré responded in fluent French, with his aide providing simultaneous translation. Mr. Gates, I welcome you to Burkina Faso. I hope you understand that any discussion we have must be based on mutual respect and genuine partnership. My people have experienced too many promises from foreign visitors that resulted in little real improvement in their daily lives. The directness of Traoré's opening statement seemed to energize rather than offend Gates. The Microsoft founder had dealt with skeptical government leaders around the world and appreciated honest communication over diplomatic pleasantries. He leaned forward slightly, signaling his readiness to engage in substantive conversation. Captain, I completely understand your caution, Gates replied. In fact, that skepticism is one of the reasons I wanted to meet with you personally. Too many international development projects have failed because they were designed by outsiders without proper input from local leaders and communities. We want to do something different here. Traoré gestured for his guest to sit at the conference table, and both men were joined by their respective teams. The Gates Foundation delegation included Dr. Susan Chen, a vaccine specialist who had worked in Africa for over a decade, and David Williams, a program director responsible for the Foundation's West African initiatives. Traoré's team consisted of his health minister, Dr. Aminata Kone, economic advisor, Professor Jean-Baptiste Sawadogo, and his trusted aide, Colonel Marie Ouedraogo. Let me be specific about what we are proposing. Gates continued as the meeting began in earnest. We have developed a new approach to vaccine distribution and healthcare infrastructure that we believe could transform rural healthcare across West Africa. Instead of the traditional model where vaccines are manufactured elsewhere and shipped to Africa, we want to create local production facilities and training programs. Dr. Chen opened a tablet and showed detailed presentations about the proposed program. Captain Traoré, what makes this different is that Burkina Faso would not just receive vaccines. Your country would become a regional hub for vaccine production and distribution. This means jobs for your people, technology transfer, and long-term economic benefits that extend far beyond healthcare. The young captain studied the presentations carefully, asking detailed questions about every aspect of the proposal. His health minister, Dr. Kone, engaged in technical discussions with Dr. Chen about vaccine safety, effectiveness, and production requirements. Professor Sawadogo analyzed the economic projections and job creation estimates with David Williams. This sounds promising in theory, Traoré said after reviewing the initial materials, but I need to understand the practical realities. How much control would Burkina Faso have over this program? What happens if our priorities change, or if we decide that certain approaches are not working for our people? Gates appreciated the captain's systematic approach to evaluation. Captain, let me be clear about something important. The Gates Foundation has learned from past mistakes in international development. We are not interested in creating dependency relationships or imposing solutions from the outside. Our role would be to provide initial funding, technical expertise, and international connections. The program would be owned and operated by Burkina Faso. Colonel Ouedraogo, who had remained silent during most of the technical discussions, finally spoke up. Mr. Gates, Captain Traoré has made commitments to the people of Burkina Faso about self-reliance and independence. How do we ensure that this partnership strengthens rather than undermines those goals? The question seemed to strike at the heart of the entire meeting. Gates paused for a moment, considering his response carefully. Colonel, that is exactly the right question to ask. The answer is that success for us means success for Burkina Faso. If this program works, your country becomes stronger, more self-sufficient, and better able to solve its own problems. If it creates dependency or fails to benefit your people directly, then it will have failed by our own measures. Traoré leaned back in his chair, processing everything he had heard. The proposal was more ambitious and comprehensive than he had expected. Instead of simply providing vaccines or funding existing programs, the Gates Foundation was offering to help Burkina Faso become a regional leader in healthcare innovation and production. Mr. Gates, I appreciate your direct approach and your willingness to discuss these issues openly, Traoré said. However, I cannot make any commitments without thoroughly consulting with my government, our parliament, and representatives from the communities that would be most affected by this program. Gates nodded approvingly. Captain, I would be concerned if you wanted to make immediate decisions about something this significant. Good leadership requires careful consideration and broad consultation. What I hope is that we can establish a framework for continued dialogue and detailed planning. The meeting continued for over 3 hours, covering topics ranging from vaccine manufacturing technology to community health worker training programs. Both sides asked challenging questions and provided detailed answers. The atmosphere remained professional, but gradually became more collaborative as the discussions progressed. As the formal meeting concluded, Gates and Traoré spent a few minutes talking privately while their teams organized follow-up materials and scheduled additional consultations. The personal conversation revealed shared concerns about global inequality, the importance of education, and the responsibility that comes with leadership. Captain, Gates said as they prepared to part ways. Regardless of what you decide about our specific proposals, I want you to know that I believe Africa's future depends on leaders like you. Your commitment to your people and your careful approach to international partnerships give me hope. Traoré smiled genuinely for the first time during the meeting. Mr. Gates, I have heard many promises from wealthy foreigners over the years. What I appreciate about today is that you seem to understand that real partnership requires respect and shared responsibility. If we move forward together, it will be as equals working toward common goals. The two men shook hands again. This time with less formal ceremony but perhaps more genuine connection. Neither man made any public statements immediately after the meeting, understanding that the real work would happen in the detailed negotiations and consultations that would follow. The weeks following the historic handshake were filled with intense activity that remained largely hidden from public view. Captain Traoré had returned to his daily routine of governing Burkina Faso, but now a significant portion of his time was devoted to analyzing the Gates Foundation proposal and consulting with various stakeholders about its potential implications. In a series of closed-door meetings with his cabinet, Traoré systematically examined every aspect of the proposed Gates partnership. The discussions were frank and sometimes heated, as government officials debated whether accepting foreign assistance, even from a respected philanthropist like Gates, aligned with their goals of achieving true independence and self-reliance. Dr. Aminata Kone, the health minister, had become one of the strongest advocates for moving forward with the partnership, having spent years watching preventable diseases claim lives across Burkina Faso. She saw the Gates Foundation proposal as an opportunity to save thousands of lives while building long-term healthcare capacity. Captain, she argued during one late-night cabinet session, we cannot let pride prevent us from accepting help that could transform our healthcare system. The proposal does not ask us to compromise our sovereignty. Instead, it offers us the tools to become more self-sufficient in the long run. However, other cabinet members expressed serious concerns about the potential risks involved. Professor Jean-Baptiste Sawadogo, the economic advisor, worried about the economic implications of such a large-scale partnership with a foreign foundation. We must consider what happens if the Gates Foundation changes its priorities, or if Bill Gates himself is no longer involved in decision-making, Sawadogo cautioned. Are we prepared to continue these programs independently if external support disappears? Do we have the financial resources and technical expertise to maintain vaccine production facilities without ongoing assistance? Colonel Marie Ouedraogo, Traoré's most trusted aide, approached the issue from a security perspective. She had researched similar partnerships in other African countries and found mixed results that concerned her about Burkina Faso's specific situation. Captain, I have studied what happened in Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya when they entered into large-scale health partnerships with international organizations, she reported. Some programs succeeded brilliantly, while others created problems that those countries are still trying to solve. The key difference seems to be how much control the African governments maintained over program design and implementation. Traoré listened carefully to all perspectives, taking detailed notes and asking probing questions about each concern raised by his advisors. The young leader had learned that effective decision-making required gathering diverse viewpoints and thinking through potential consequences before taking action. Meanwhile, parallel discussions were taking place within the Gates Foundation's offices in Seattle. Bill Gates himself was personally involved in strategy sessions about the Burkina Faso partnership, recognizing that the success or failure of this initiative could influence similar programs across Africa. Dr. Susan Chen, who had participated in the initial meeting with Traoré, was leading a team of experts in developing detailed implementation plans that addressed the concerns raised by the Burkinabe government. The Foundation's approach had evolved significantly over the years, incorporating lessons learned from previous partnerships and criticism from African leaders and civil society organizations. We need to be absolutely clear about what success looks like for both sides, Dr. Chen told her team during one planning session. Captain Traoré is right to be cautious about foreign partnerships, Too many African countries have been burned by well-intentioned programs that created dependency rather than building local capacity. David Williams, the program director, had been working closely with economists and health policy experts to refine the financial structure of the proposed partnership. The foundation was prepared to make substantial investments in infrastructure and training, but they wanted to ensure that Burkina Faso would have genuine ownership of the programs from the beginning. The captain asked tough questions about control and decision-making authority, Williams noted. Our proposal needs to demonstrate clearly how Burkina Faso will gradually assume complete responsibility for all aspects of the vaccine production and distribution system. This cannot be another aid program disguised as partnership. Back in Ouagadougou, Traoré had decided to expand his consultations beyond his immediate cabinet. He organized meetings with traditional leaders, civil society organizations, healthcare workers, and representatives from rural communities that would be most affected by the proposed vaccine programs. These community consultations revealed both enthusiasm and skepticism about the Gates Foundation partnership. Rural health workers were excited about the possibility of having reliable vaccine supplies and better training programs. However, some community leaders expressed concerns about foreign involvement in healthcare decisions that affected their people. During a meeting with traditional chiefs from across Burkina Faso, Elder Burema Ouedraogo raised questions that resonated with many participants. Young captain, we have seen many foreigners come to our land with promises of help. Some kept their promises, but others used our trust for their own benefit. How do we know this Gates man is different? Traoré appreciated the elder's directness and took time to explain what he had learned about the Gates Foundation's work in other countries. He also shared his own analysis of the potential benefits and risks involved in the proposed partnership. Elder, I share your caution about foreign involvement in our affairs, Traoré responded. That is why I am consulting with leaders like you before making any decisions. If we move forward with this partnership, it will be because we believe it serves our people's interests and strengthens rather than weakens our independence. The community consultations also revealed practical concerns about vaccine production and distribution that had not been fully addressed in the initial Gates Foundation proposal. Rural communities wanted assurance that new vaccines would be accessible and affordable for poor families. They also wanted to understand how local healthcare workers would be involved in the expanded vaccination programs. Traoré compiled detailed feedback from all his consultations and requested additional meetings with the Gates Foundation team to address specific concerns raised by various stakeholders. The young leader was determined to ensure that any partnership agreement reflected the needs and priorities identified through his extensive consultation process. The Gates Foundation responded positively to Traoré's request for additional discussions, recognizing that the captain's thorough approach to decision-making was exactly the kind of leadership they needed for a successful partnership. Bill Gates himself expressed willingness to return to Burkina Faso for follow-up meetings if necessary. During this period of intensive analysis and consultation, both Traoré and Gates were also dealing with external pressure from various sources. Some international health organizations worried that a high-profile partnership between the Gates Foundation and Burkina Faso might divert attention and resources from their own programs in the region. Meanwhile, some African intellectuals and activists criticized the proposed partnership as another example of wealthy foreigners imposing solutions on African countries. These critics argued that African governments should develop their own healthcare programs without relying on foreign philanthropy, even from well-intentioned sources like the Gates Foundation. Traoré was particularly sensitive to these criticisms because they aligned with his own philosophical commitment to African self-reliance and independence. However, he also recognized that ideological purity might sometimes conflict with practical opportunities to improve people's lives in the short term while building long-term capacity. The captain spent many evenings reading reports, analyzing data, and thinking through the complex political, economic, and ethical dimensions of the proposed partnership. He consulted with trusted advisors, but ultimately understood that the final decision would rest with him and carry significant consequences for his country's future development trajectory. While Captain Traoré was conducting his careful consultations about the Gates Foundation partnership, Powerful forces were quietly mobilizing against the proposed vaccine program. The opposition came from unexpected directions and revealed the complex web of interests that surrounded international health initiatives in Africa. The first signs of organized resistance emerged from within Burkina Faso's pharmaceutical industry. Local drug distributors and medical supply companies had built profitable businesses importing medications and vaccines from Europe and Asia. They realized that a domestic vaccine production facility could threaten their established market position and reduce their profits significantly. Dr. Mamadou Diarra, who owned one of the country's largest pharmaceutical distribution companies, began reaching out to other business leaders to express his concerns about the Gates Foundation proposal. During a private dinner at his luxurious compound in Ouagadougou, he gathered several influential entrepreneurs to discuss their response strategy. Friends, we must think carefully about what this partnership means for our businesses and our economy, Dr. Diarra told his guests. If Burkina Faso starts producing its own vaccines, what happens to the companies that have invested years building relationships with international suppliers? Are we supposed to simply accept that our livelihoods will be destroyed by foreign charity? Among the dinner guests was Fatimata Sawadogo, who controlled much of the country's medical equipment import business. She had built her company through careful relationship management and understood the political dimensions of the healthcare industry better than most people realized. Mamadou, you are right to be concerned, she responded. But we must be strategic about how we express our opposition. If we appear to be opposing healthcare improvements for selfish reasons, we will lose public support and possibly face government retaliation. We need to find principled arguments against this partnership. The group spent several hours developing a strategy that would frame their opposition in terms of national sovereignty and economic independence rather than business interests. They decided to fund research and advocacy efforts that would highlight potential problems with the Gates Foundation partnership while promoting alternative approaches to healthcare development. Meanwhile, international forces were also beginning to mobilize against the proposed partnership. Pharmaceutical companies in Europe and the United States had been monitoring the Gates Foundation's activities in Africa with growing concern. The prospect of local vaccine production in countries like Burkina Faso threatened their profitable export markets across the continent. A confidential memo circulated among executives at several major pharmaceutical corporations outlined their concerns about the precedent that successful vaccine production in Burkina Faso might establish. If one African country could successfully produce vaccines domestically, other nations might demand similar capabilities, potentially reducing global pharmaceutical companies' market share significantly. These corporations began funding research, institutions, and advocacy groups that specialized in raising questions about vaccine safety and international development programs. They did not directly oppose the Gates Foundation partnership, but instead promoted studies and policy papers that raised concerns about the risks of rapid vaccine program expansion in developing countries. Dr. Richard Morrison, a British epidemiologist who had previously worked for several pharmaceutical companies, published a research paper questioning whether African countries had sufficient regulatory infrastructure to oversee vaccine production safely. His paper, funded by a European Pharmaceutical Industry Association, received widespread attention in international health policy circles. While well-intentioned, programs like the one proposed in Burkina Faso may create serious risks for public health, Dr. Morrison wrote. Local vaccine production requires sophisticated quality control systems and regulatory oversight that may not exist in countries with limited administrative capacity. Rushing to establish these programs could potentially result in vaccine safety problems that would undermine public confidence in immunization across Africa. Back in Burkina Faso, these international criticisms found resonance among some local intellectuals and civil society leaders who were already skeptical about foreign involvement in national healthcare policy. Professor Alassane Kone, a respected political scientist at the University of Ouagadougou, began organizing academic conferences and public discussions about the implications of accepting large-scale foreign assistance. We must ask ourselves difficult questions about the long-term consequences of these partnerships, Professor Kone argued. during a well-attended university seminar. Even if the Gates Foundation has good intentions, are we prepared for the dependency relationships that such programs typically create? What happens to our healthcare system if this foreign support disappears in 10 years? Colonel Marie Ouedraogo, Traoré's trusted aide, had been quietly monitoring these various opposition activities through intelligence networks and diplomatic channels. She compiled detailed reports about the sources of funding for critical research, papers, and the connections between local opposition groups and international business interests. "Captain, we are facing a coordinated campaign against the Gates partnership," she reported during a private briefing. "Some of the opposition appears to be driven by legitimate concerns about sovereignty and dependency. However, other critics seem to be motivated by business interests rather than genuine concern for public welfare." The colonel's investigation had revealed sophisticated networks linking local pharmaceutical distributors with international corporations and advocacy groups. Money was flowing through multiple channels to fund research, conferences, and media campaigns designed to raise doubts about the Gates Foundation partnership. Traoré was not surprised by the emergence of opposition to his potential partnership with Gates. The young leader had experienced similar resistance when implementing other reform programs, and he understood that significant changes always threatened established interests. However, the captain was concerned about the sophistication and international scope of the opposition campaign. The involvement of foreign corporations and advocacy groups suggested that his decision about the Gates partnership had implications far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. "Marie, I need you to continue monitoring these activities," Traoré instructed his aide. "But I also want you to engage directly with some of these critics. I want to understand which concerns are legitimate and which are simply attempts to protect business interests at the expense of public health." The colonel arranged a series of private meetings between Traoré and various opposition figures. These conversations revealed the complexity of the debate surrounding international health partnerships and helped the captain understand the different perspectives involved. During a particularly intense discussion with Dr. Diarra, the pharmaceutical distributor, Traoré challenged his critic to propose alternative solutions to Burkina Faso's healthcare challenges. "Doctor, I appreciate your concerns about foreign dependency and business disruption," the captain said. "But what specific alternatives do you recommend for reducing child mortality and improving vaccine access in rural communities?" Dr. Diarra struggled to provide concrete alternatives that did not involve either accepting foreign assistance or making massive government investments that Burkina Faso could not afford. His difficulty in answering the captain's direct question revealed the limitations of opposition arguments that focused on criticizing the Gates partnership without offering practical alternatives. Similar conversations with other critics helped Traoré separate legitimate concerns from self-interested opposition. He began developing responses to valid criticisms while dismissing arguments that seemed designed primarily to protect established business interests or advance foreign corporate agendas. The captain also discovered that some of the most vocal critics had never actually read the detailed Gates Foundation proposal or participated in community consultations about healthcare needs. Their opposition seemed based on ideological positions rather than careful analysis of the specific partnership terms being negotiated. At the same time, Traoré found that some critics raised important points about implementation challenges and potential risks that had not been adequately addressed in the initial partnership discussions. These insights helped him develop additional questions and conditions for continued negotiations with the Gates Foundation. The opposition campaign also had unintended positive effects on the partnership development process. Media attention generated by critics forced both Traoré and the Gates Foundation to be more transparent about their negotiations and more responsive to public concerns about the proposed programs. Bill Gates himself acknowledged that criticism of the partnership had helped improve their approach to working with African governments. "The questions being raised in Burkina Faso are exactly the kinds of issues that we need to address openly," he said during a private conversation with his foundation team. "Captain Traoré is right to take these concerns seriously, and we should be grateful for the opportunity to develop better partnership models." The pressure on Captain Traoré reached its peak as months of consultation, analysis, and debate culminated in the need for a definitive decision about the Gates Foundation partnership. The young leader had gathered more information than any African head of state had ever compiled about a major international development partnership, but the weight of the final choice still felt enormous. On a quiet Sunday morning in his private residence, Traoré sat alone with the complete file of documents, reports, and recommendations that had been compiled during the extensive evaluation process. The stack of papers represented hundreds of hours of meetings, consultations, research, and analysis involving everyone from village elders to international health experts. The captain had developed a systematic framework for evaluating the partnership, based on 5 key criteria that reflected his core commitments to the people of Burkina Faso. First, would the partnership genuinely improve health outcomes for ordinary citizens, especially children and people living in rural areas? Second, would it strengthen rather than weaken Burkina Faso's long-term capacity for self-reliance and independence? Third, would it provide fair economic benefits that justified any risks involved? Fourth, could the terms be structured to maintain appropriate government control over policy decisions? Finally, did it align with his broader vision for transforming Burkina Faso into a more prosperous and equitable society? Based on his comprehensive analysis, Traoré had concluded that the Gates Foundation partnership, if properly structured, could meet all 5 criteria. The proposed vaccine production facility would create hundreds of skilled jobs while reducing the country's dependence on imported medical supplies. The training programs would build local expertise that could be applied to other healthcare challenges, beyond vaccination. Most importantly, the partnership could save thousands of lives by improving access to essential vaccines across West Africa. However, the captain had also identified specific conditions that would need to be included in any final agreement to address legitimate concerns raised during the consultation process. Burkina Faso would need to maintain majority ownership of the vaccine production facility and complete decision-making authority over which vaccines to produce and how to distribute them. The partnership would need to include guaranteed technology, transfer provisions that would enable the country to continue operations independently if Gates Foundation support ended. Additionally, a significant portion of the economic benefits would need to be directed toward training and employing local citizens rather than international consultants. Traoré called Colonel Ouedraogo to his residence and shared his preliminary decision with his most trusted advisor. "Marie, I believe this partnership can serve our people's interests if we negotiate the terms carefully," he told her. "But I want your honest assessment of the political risks involved in moving forward." The colonel had prepared for this conversation by analyzing potential domestic and international reactions to various decision scenarios. "Captain, supporting the partnership will generate criticism from some quarters, but I believe most Burkinabe people will support a decision that promises to improve healthcare while maintaining our sovereignty. The key will be communicating clearly about the safeguards and conditions we have negotiated." That evening, Traoré convened an emergency cabinet meeting to share his decision and seek final input from his senior advisors. The discussion was intense but ultimately unanimous in supporting the captain's approach, with various ministers offering suggestions for refining specific terms and implementation strategies. Dr. Aminata Kone, the health minister, expressed particular enthusiasm about the potential for transforming Burkina Faso's healthcare system. "Captain, this partnership could make our country a model for the entire continent," she said. "If we can demonstrate that African nations can maintain control over their development partnerships while achieving significant improvements in public health, it will inspire similar initiatives throughout Africa." Professor Sawadogo, the economics advisor, had completed detailed financial projections showing that the partnership could generate substantial economic returns for Burkina Faso over the long term. The initial Gates Foundation investment will be recouped through job creation, reduced healthcare costs, and potential export revenues within 7 years, he reported. After that point, the program becomes a significant contributor to our national economy. With his cabinet support confirmed, Traoré authorized Colonel Ouedraogo to contact the Gates Foundation and request a final negotiation session to finalize the partnership terms. The captain insisted that Bill Gates himself participate in these crucial discussions to ensure that both sides fully understood their commitments and expectations. The Gates Foundation responded immediately to Traoré's request, with Bill Gates agreeing to return to Ouagadougou within 2 weeks for the final negotiations. The Microsoft founder had been following the extensive consultation process in Burkina Faso with admiration and understood that the partnership's success would depend on addressing all concerns raised by various stakeholders. During the intervening period, both sides worked intensively to refine legal documents, technical specifications, and implementation timelines that would govern the partnership. The Gates Foundation's legal team collaborated closely with Burkinabe government lawyers to ensure that all agreements reflected the conditions and safeguards identified through the consultation process. Dr. Susan Chen and her technical team developed detailed plans for the vaccine production facility that incorporated feedback from local healthcare workers and community representatives. The revised proposal included provisions for training programs that would prioritize hiring and developing Burkinabe citizens for all key positions within the facility. When Gates arrived in Ouagadougou for the final negotiations, the atmosphere was markedly different from their first meeting months earlier. Both leaders now had detailed understanding of each other's priorities and constraints, and they approached the discussions as partners working to finalize a mutually beneficial agreement rather than strangers exploring possibilities. Captain Traoré, I want to begin by commending you for the thoroughness of your consultation process, Gates said as the final negotiations began. The conditions and safeguards you have identified will make this partnership stronger and more sustainable than anything we could have designed without your input and community feedback. The final negotiation sessions lasted 3 days and covered every aspect of the proposed partnership in exhaustive detail. Both sides made